Lincoln can trace its origins to Henry Leland and the breakup of the Henry Ford Company in 1902, when Henry Ford's part of the company became the Ford Motor Company, and Henry Leland reorganized the remaining part of the company into Cadillac, which became part of GM in 1909, with Leland staying on the board of directors. But when the U.S. joined the First World War in 1917, William Durant declined using GM facilities for war production, so Leland left GM to build the Lincoln factory, named after Abraham Lincoln, to produce Liberty V-12 aircraft engines. After the war, Leland returned to car production with the Lincoln Model L, a premium luxury car that was offered with custom coachwork, initially on a 130-inch wheelbase, and powered by a 5.9-liter 358 cubic inch V8 with 90 horsepower. A chassis cost around $4,000, and a complete car around $6,500. But with the post-war recession, Lincoln sold fewer than 3,000 cars by 1922 and was bankrupt, so Henry Ford was able to take over the company for approximately half its actual value, with his son Edsel becoming the new company president. Edsel Ford was impressed by the car's design and engineering, so they saw few changes: more efficient manufacturing to reduce costs, regular styling updates, and a longer 136-inch wheelbase. The engine was enlarged in 1928 to 6.3 liters, or 385 cubic inches, to produce more torque, but still had 90 horsepower. The Model L was replaced by a more modern Model K in 1931, and the engine saw several updates, bumping output to 120 horsepower. Initially, it was on a 145-inch wheelbase, but with the Depression, a cheaper 136-inch wheelbase version returned, and the top versions moved to a V12, a 7.3-liter 448 cubic inch engine with 150 horsepower to start, although there would be several variations before the Model K was dropped after 1940. In 1936, Lincoln introduced the smaller and cheaper Zephyr to bridge the gap between Lincoln and Ford. The Zephyr was 203 to 210 inches long on either a 122 or 125-inch wheelbase, and powered by a 4.4-liter 267 cubic inch V12 with 110 horsepower. It started around $1,300, compared to the Model K's $4,200, which still had 150 horsepower, but was now using a 6.8-liter 414 cubic inch V12. With the introduction of the Zephyr-based Continental in 1940, the Model K was phased out, and soon the 120 horsepower 4.8-liter 292 V12 would be the only engine. But with the introduction of the Mercury division, the Zephyr had effectively lost its purpose, and entry-level Lincolns would simply be called the H-Series after World War II. But 1949 would see all Ford products redesigned, and the top-of-the-line Lincoln would be called the Cosmopolitan. It was on a 125-inch wheelbase, while lesser Lincolns were on a 121-inch wheelbase. Length was 212 to 220, and weight 4,000 to 4,400 pounds. Power came from a 5.5-liter 337 cubic inch V8 with 152 horsepower, and prices ranged from $2,500 to $4,000. The cars would be restyled in 1952 and were 214 inches long on a 123-inch wheelbase and 4,200 to 4,400 pounds. Top models were now called Capri, and the engine was a smaller 5.2-liter 318, while horsepower was up to 160. Following the trend of new, more upmarket trim levels with each restyle, 1956 introduced the Premier, up to 223 inches long on a 126-inch wheelbase and weighing 4,300 to 4,500 pounds. Its 6-liter 368 cubic inch V8 produced 275 horsepower, bringing top speed to 115 miles an hour, while the quarter mile took just over 17 seconds. At the same time, Ford would introduce a new Continental as its own division. It was on the same wheelbase and used the same engine with 10 more horsepower. Only 219 inches long, it was still heavier at 4,800 pounds and cost twice as much at $9,700. But in 1958, the two cars would effectively become the same car, sold as the Lincoln Capri and Premier, and Continental Mark III, IV, and V, 229 inches long on a 131-inch wheelbase, and still 4,800 pounds, with a 7-liter 430 pumping out 295 horsepower. The blending of the two models would continue with the 1961 redesign, as all Lincolns would be called Continentals, only offered as a four-door sedan or phaeton, and back down to 212 inches long on a 123-inch wheelbase. But weight was 4,900 to 5,300 pounds, and it would see regular updates to styling and regular increases to power. 1966 would see the return of the two-door version, and the engine increased to a 7.6-liter 462 with 340 horsepower. And 1969 would see a new engine design, similarly sized at 460 cubic inches, with horsepower up 25 and torque up 15 to 500, as well as a new, smaller Continental Mark III personal coupe, only 216 inches long on a 117-inch wheelbase, and 4,700 pounds, while the standard Lincoln Continental got bigger for 1970, 225 inches long on a 127-inch wheelbase, but only 4,700 to 4,800 pounds. 2 years later, the Mark III would be replaced by the Mark IV, also bigger at 220 inches long on a 120-inch wheelbase, and up to 5,000 pounds. 1977 was a big year of change for Lincoln that included the use of smaller engines, starting with a 6.6-liter 400. Like the rest of the U.S. industry, they had switched to net ratings in 1972, putting the 400 at 182 horsepower and the 460 at 208. The standard Continentals got a facelift to look more like the Mark series and were priced around $9,500. There was a new Mark V, stretched to 230 inches on the same wheelbase, but not any heavier, and priced just over $11,000. And the compact Versailles was introduced, based on the Ford Granada. It was 201 inches long on a 110-inch wheelbase, weighing 3,800 to 3,900 pounds, with either a 5-liter 302 or 5.8-liter 351. Horsepower ranged from 122 to 135, sales were just over 15,000 for the year, and price was near $12,000. For 1980, both the standard Continental and the new Mark VI moved to the smaller Panther platform, and essentially became the same car in different trim. There was even a four-door version of the Mark. Most were 219 inches long on a 117-inch wheelbase and around 4,000 pounds, but the two-door version of the Mark VI was 3 inches shorter, and the engines were the 302 and 351 V8s. The following year, the standard Continental simply became the town car, and the Versailles was dropped, with a new smaller Continental introduced to the midsize market for 1982 using the Fox format. It was 201 inches long on a 109-inch wheelbase and 3,400 to 3,600 pounds, initially with either a 3.8-liter V6 with 112 horsepower or a 5-liter V8 with 131 horsepower. It would be joined by a two-door version the next year as the new Mark VII. There would also be a new front-wheel drive Continental for 1988, based on the Ford Taurus, up to 205 inches long, but it was still on a 109-inch wheelbase and 3,600 pounds, powered by a 140 horsepower version of the 3.8-liter V6. The town car would get updated styling for 1990 and would move to a 4.6-liter overhead cam V8 with 190 to 210 horsepower the following year. The Mark VIII, introduced in 1993, would be the last of the series, using a 280 horsepower version of the same engine. In 1995, the Continental would get restyled, longer and heavier, and upgrading to the 4.6-liter V8. 1998 would be the final year of the Mark VIII. The town car would be restyled once again, and Lincoln would introduce the Navigator, a version of Ford's Expedition full-size SUV. Far from the biggest Lincoln ever, at 205 inches long on a 119-inch wheelbase and 5,200 to 5,600 pounds, powered by a 5.4-liter Triton V8 with 230 horsepower, which was soon followed by a short-lived pickup version called the Blackwood. It had several unusual features that included a fake wood grain bed and a split side-hinge tailgate. Poorly received, at least partly due to its $52,000 starting price, or $8,000 more than the Navigator. In 2000, Lincoln introduced the rear-wheel drive LS in an attempt to better compete with imports. Sharing its platform with the Jaguar S-Type, it was 194 inches long on a 115-inch wheelbase and 3,900 pounds, with either a 210 horsepower 3-liter V6 or 352 horsepower 3.9-liter V8, starting at only $35,000. The V8 was a 15-second car with a top speed near 145. The Continental would be killed off after 2002, and in 2003, Lincoln applied the Navigator treatment to the Ford Explorer to create the Aviator. Only 193 inches long on a 114-inch wheelbase, it was powered by a 302 horsepower version of the 4.6-liter V8. At $43,000, it was $7,000 less than the Navigator at the time, but still didn't sell well. So they attempted a full-size pickup again in 2005, without all the gimmicks. Available as either a long or short bed, and more reasonably priced, starting under $40,000. It still didn't do particularly well, selling under $40,000 over its 5 years in the U.S., although it would continue an additional 5 years in Mexico. The LS would be discontinued after 2006, when they would revive the Zephyr name on a car based on the Ford Fusion, 191 inches long on a 107-inch wheelbase and 3,400 pounds, initially powered by a 3-liter V6 with 221 horsepower, only to be renamed MKZ and upgraded to a 3.5-liter with 265 horsepower the following year. And most models would get an MK designation going forward. An exception would be the third-generation Navigator that arrived at the same time. But that was followed by a Lincoln version of the Ford Edge as the MKX, 187 inches long on a 111-inch wheelbase and 4,200 to 4,400 pounds, powered by the 3.5-liter V6. In 2009, the MKS would effectively replace the Town Car, which still carried on through 2011. The MKS was 204 inches long on a 113-inch wheelbase and 4,100 to 4,300 pounds, using a 275 horsepower 3.7-liter V6. 2010 would see the introduction of the large crossover MKT, 208 inches long on a 118-inch wheelbase and roughly 4,900 pounds. Initially with either a 270 horsepower 3.7-liter V6 or a 3.5-liter EcoBoost with 355 horsepower. In spite of sales never coming close to 10,000 annually, it would carry on for over a decade. And a smaller SUV would arrive for 2015 as the MKC, only 179 inches long on a 106-inch wheelbase, weighing 3,800 to 4,000 pounds, with either a 2-liter or 2.3-liter EcoBoost 4 with 240 to 285 horsepower. The Navigator would get a facelift, the MKX would get updated the following year, but Lincoln would soon be moving back to actual names, meaning the MKX would become the Nautilus for 2017, and the MKS would be replaced by a new Continental, 201 inches long on a 118-inch wheelbase and around 4,400 pounds, with either a 305 horsepower 3.7-liter Duratec V6 or a 335 horsepower 2.7-liter EcoBoost V6. The Navigator would be updated again for 2018, and for 2020 the MKC would be replaced by the Corsair and the MKT by a new Aviator. But the next year, both the Continental and the MKZ would be discontinued, meaning the only car would be the new Zephyr, or simply Z, which is made and sold in China. Essentially, a sedan version of the Corsair. Lincoln has never been terribly profitable, and at this point is little more than better trimmed versions of Ford SUVs, or similar to what Mercury once was. So we will have to see how long it retains an identity, or for that matter, an existence. Now as always, thanks for watching, don't forget to comment below, and like and subscribe.